In this video I'm going to take a look at manipulating this image, which is a raw untouched file. It's shot in rainforest conditions, very dark conditions, high ISO, problems of depth of field. We have a bit of coolness in the shot because of those conditions. But what we're going to create is something a little different, I think. That's the finished image. And the vast majority of the work is simply adjustments in tone, contrast and colour. But we can change the image significantly and I believe give it a heap more appeal. Before we start any work at all in Adobe Camera Raw with this particular image, let's take a look at the metadata and how the image was shot, because I think many photographers are going to see some similarities here, things they've experienced, things they've had to overcome themselves. This is one of those situations where we're up against it from a technical point of view. If we look up at the top of Adobe Camera Raw just for a moment, let's look at the metadata here, which is giving us our exposure. I had to increase my ISO because I'm shooting into a dark rainforest situation. Although it doesn't look very dark here, the reason for that will be apparent in a moment. You can see I'm using a 100 to 400 zoom, backed off just a little bit from the maximum because this particular bird is quite large. It's about the size of a kestrel or a large pigeon. I needed the 400 ISO just to be able to get 125th of a second, which isn't a very fast shutter speed. I did manage to get the sweet spot on the lens of f8. The maximum aperture of this lens is actually 5.6. So it would have been possible for me to reduce f8 to 5.6 and I could have pushed my shutter speed up to 250th of a second. But of course the problem we have when we're focusing close with a long lens is we've got a very shallow depth of field. We know that if the bird was to just move its head a little bit towards me, then it's quite easy for the bird to move its beak and eye out of my plane of focus. So we've got to keep depth of field in mind all of the time. We've also got to be aware of the bird's movement, because birds move very, very quickly. A movement of the head at 125th of a second and maybe even at 250th of a second is enough to put a bit of blur in place. So when we're shooting in these conditions and we're using a lens which is approaching 300mm, 400 ISO at 125th of a second, we need to have our camera pretty steady because we've got the depth of field to consider, we've got the movement of the subject to consider. The last thing we want to do is introduce any movement of the photographer and the camera. So my camera was on a tripod. The clamps that hold it tight were just loose enough to enable me to move it, but the camera was still on a steady platform. If you're not using a tripod, then you can always rest your camera on your camera bag. I've done that before, but you do need something solid in these types of conditions. So why does the image look fairly bright? Well, because I've chosen to expose to the right here, meaning to try to defeat any noise that I introduce by using a high ISO. And during the same photographic session, at times my camera was actually increased to 1600 ISO. And the very first way we can defeat the noise or help to lessen the impact is to make sure we don't underexpose anything. So what I always do is squeeze as much light into my sensor, but I don't allow it to go so far that I start to lose highlight detail. Now in the low light conditions we have here, that's not so difficult. When we try to expose to the right in higher contrast lighting, that's when it gets just a little bit more tricky. So one of the things I've done here is to minimize the noise. Now I can show you that by zooming into the background very tight, and you can see there's not a great deal of noise considering we're looking at this almost at 300%. I'm going to reset that with a right click and fit in view. The trouble is with a manipulation like this, I think the background is almost always going to need a different exposure, contrast, colour than the main subject. So I'm going to treat these as two separate things. So let me make a start by going to the option and select my lens corrections. I'm going to tick to remove chromatic aberration and also to enable the profile corrections for the lens that I'm using. You see that little pop where any distortion that's known has been corrected for. What I'm going to turn to next is just this background. So I'm going to go to my basic tab and I'm going to drop down the exposure. I'm going to take it down quite a bit, something like that. And what I may do is even put a filter over that using the Radial Filter here. Click and drag. We can adjust this after it's been created just by clicking and dragging it around, as you can see. I'm going to move my cursor in the middle of that, right click and clear any settings because it will always remember the last settings we used. And I'm going to touch the V key to hide that selection. Still there and it's still working. Now I'm just going to drop the exposure a bit in the outer edge just to put focus back on the bird, which we'll manipulate in a moment. Now the last thing I may do, I did show you the fact that we didn't have masses of noise in the background. Perhaps if I double click the zoom tool and we get the image up to 100%, if I can find a dark area, I think you may have trouble seeing a great deal of noise in this particular image because you're viewing a slightly compressed video. I'll bring it up a bit more because I'm going to go to my sharpening options, but I'm going to use noise reduction. Just a little bit of luminance, maybe about 20, and if I double click you may see just a slight change there, but most of the changes we make are going to be small and measured. Now right click again, fit in view. Happy with what I've got so far, I'm going to open this up in Photoshop. Now I'm opening this up as a smart object. Perhaps I should show you that. Go down to the bottom and click the hyperlink. You can see I'm working with a 16-bit per channel image, but down here I've got a little box ticked which says open in Photoshop as a smart object. So let's do that. Now I suppose I could have cropped this image within Camera Raw, but there's no great advantage I think in cropping it there or here. If I just put the crop tool over the top of this, you can see that the composition isn't too bad. I would be limited anyway on what I could do. I could probably lose a little bit from the top, I could possibly lose a little bit from the bottom. But other than that, I think the bird is pretty nicely placed. So we can choose to do that in Camera Raw, but I think I'll save this until a little bit later. So for the moment, I'll back away from that. But what I need to do now is to consider the bird, because in darkening the background, of course, I've darkened the bird far too much. Now what I can do is to go to my layers. I've got a smart object here, which means I can open this back up into Camera Raw, but if I go to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy, I've now got two versions of my raw file. Both of them can be manipulated independently of each other. So if I select the bottom of the two and double click, I can have this back open into Camera Raw, and now we can manipulate this and consider just the bird. Now of course I didn't have to open up that original image and make two copies of the smart object. I could have stayed with this one here and then use my adjustment brush to lighten the tones in the bird. I just prefer to work in a different way, and this, I think, is all about workflow. It's not how we get to the end result, it's the end result that counts. But the whole point of these particular videos is this is my way. I think where I'll start is by going to that circular filter, selecting it, clicking the pin to liven up the changes I previously made, and delete them. I'm then going to hit my H key on the keyboard. It's H for the hand tool, just enables me to jump from the settings of the radial filter back to the basic tab in this case, but I want to go to the detail because I'm going to take the luminance off for the bird. I want the bird to be as sharp as possible, although I almost never sharpen images these days, never seem to find the need. What do I need to do next? Well, I need to do something with the bird. First of all, I dropped the original exposure, so I could double click and reset that. So that's the starting point. So I want more vibrance in my bird because it was well sheltered. I may actually want to push the temperature up because we was in such sheltered conditions. We have a natural tendency for our image to get a bit of a blue cast, and you can probably even see that in some of the chest feathers. So I'm just going to tweak that up a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of clarity into my bird. Let's have a look at the highlights, see if I can just darken those down. You can see I can do that. It just takes them down quite a bit. Let me just lift this again. I'm going to tweak again the vibrance. I'm just looking carefully at my bird. One of the things we need to be aware of here is, firstly, we can ignore the background because we've already got that in Photoshop. But we've also got to be aware that we've got two smart objects. So even when we get this bird and our previous background married together, if we don't get them right, it's dead easy to come back into Camera Raw and just make a slight adjustment. Now, looking very carefully at my image, I'm wondering if I have got a little bit of a magenta cast in the bird, and if you look at the tint over here, I think I may have, so I may even tweak this back a bit, just making a mental note of where it was, but we can always reset these with a double click. But just going to bring this back towards the green just a little bit, not much, just a little bit, fine tuning all of the time, just making those changes I think the bird needs. I'm just looking at the histogram now, maybe some whites just to give a bit more sparkle, and maybe a little bit more on the blacks to give us a bit more impact. I think I'm going to live with this one and open this back up into Photoshop. Now when Photoshop reopens, of course, we don't see the bird we've just manipulated because we will need our layers for that. Let me pop the layers out semi-permanently here because this is the one we've just opened. So what we need to do now is to mask through the bird from this layer through this one. Only when we've done that will we get a feel for whether we've darkened the background too much, not enough, whether we've got the bird too colourful or not enough. Well, let's have a go. Look at the two symbols here. Both of these are smart objects. We've got everything going for us, and if you really want to be super safe, then just save this as a work in progress, a project. But I'm going to select the top layer. I'm going to apply a layer mask, and I'm going to use a technique which I have described dozens of times. I think this is worth its weight in gold. I'm going to start by zooming in on the bird. I'm using shortcuts here, Control Spacebar, click and drag because I want the bird to be large on screen. I've got black selected as my foreground colour. I need a soft edge brush. I know it's soft because I rarely move away from them, but there it is, basic brushes only. And with my opacity and the flow rate on the top of the screen, I'm going to set them to start at 100%. I'm going to use what I call my shift click technique, and I'll demonstrate that starting just around the point where the beak joins the feathers. Now if you just glance over to the layers, just think about what we're doing here. We're about to paint black onto the mask, which is going to allow parts of the top layer to become transparent, allowing the bottom layer to show through. So all we're doing is adjusting the exposure, contrast, tone and colour, but in strategic locations on the image. And the way I do that is by clicking, and there you can see the effect of the changes on that layer beneath, but I'm going to hold my shift key down and move a short distance. And what happens is we paint between two straight lines. If I demonstrate that over here, I can move a long distance, hold the shift and click, and you can see exactly what happens. Now you would think going round an animal like a bird, which is all curves, then painting in straight lines is a foolish thing to do. But it works, and I'll demonstrate a little bit of it. I'm going to go around the outer edge of my bird, click, holding the shift, click, 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 click. You can see with a soft edge brush, and once we've done this once or twice, it's actually quite a quick process. I've run out of space here now. So I just rest my thumb on the space bar. The tool I'm using changes to the hand. I can click and drag, and I can continue. Click, click, click. If I make a mistake, I just did there, I just switch to white. I can do that by going back to my toolbox, but it's very convenient to touch the X key, and I could just repair the little error I made as I start moving around the bird, because if we don't repair them straight away, we tend to forget them. Not forgetting to touch the X key again to bring us back to black, pick up where I left off, and if I wasn't talking and I was concentrating more, I probably wouldn't have made that little error. But we're working on a mask, so we needn't be too fretful of making the odd mistake. Now you can see that even in the few seconds it's taken to talk about this process, I've gone a considerable way around the bird. And the trick to this is when we get to curves, let me move into the center of the bird. If we had a subject that was curved, if I clicked and then shorter steps, click, 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 you can see we can actually take into account curves as well as the straight edges. So what I would do here is to go around the edge just as I've demonstrated here. When I get down to this point, let me come down to the woodwork. I don't want to increase the woodwork, so I'm going to go along the edge, and sometimes birds' feet are not very attractive, so we'll allow them to stay at the density they was. So here we've got a little bit more of a straight edge, so I could possibly make bigger steps, but be a bit careful because we want our work to be absolutely seamless. And already I'm along the bottom and on my way up, not forgetting of course we've got to do the feathers below. I'm going to take just a minute or two to finish off, and then I'll be back. Using that shift click method, going around the outside of this bird very carefully is not going to take much longer than about 5 minutes. But what I've got at the moment is just that outline created all the way around, and you can probably just see it faintly here. The reason I like this technique so much is because when I come down to areas which are softer, because if you look at the bottom of the tail, then it's more out of the plane of focus, therefore we've got a softness down here. Well, if I use a bigger brush down there, then I'm increasing the softness of the edge of that brush too. So what I'm going to do next is look at the mask in isolation, and to do that we just hold the Alt key and click the mask, and there we can see what we did. Doesn't look that elegant, but it works. What we're going to do to fill in the center, rather than do all of that manually, is allow I should say, the magic wand help us out. I'm going to click into both of those. You can see I've got a little plus alongside my magic wand. because if you look up at the top left of the screen, I've got the add one selection to another icon checked. So when I click down here, I don't lose my first selection, I actually get one added to the other. What I'm going to do next is to zoom in. Again, shortcuts, Control Spacebar, click and drag, because you'll notice that because I'm using a soft brush, the selection doesn't actually meet the edge. So I've got to move my selection a little bit towards that black line. I've got to expand it. So let's go to Select, Modify, Expand. Just do this a bit at a time. Let's just take whatever's there. 4 pixels. Let's take a look at that. Probably not quite enough, but it's not a problem, because we can go back and we can say, give me another 4 pixels. It doesn't really matter how many times we do this. Now you can see with the thinner lines, that's probably done a good job. With the thicker ones, perhaps we're a little bit tight, so I think we could probably steal another 4. Let's try. Modify, expand, 4 again. We're coming towards the edge of the thin line, but we're okay there. So what we need to do now is to flood the selection we've made. I'll hit Control 0 so you can see the entire bird. Black is at the bottom of my toolbox and it's my background color. Background colors can always be flooded with Control Backspace. Hit Control D to remove the selection, and if you see any little white areas like those little edges here, you can just pick up your brush, make sure you've got black as your foreground, make the brush as small or as large as you need it, and you can just make sure you've got no discrepancies. Here's a little line around here, but I doubt we're even going to see it. So what I want to do next is to bring all of this back in play, and I need to sit back and look at my image and decide on the balance between the two parts that I've adjusted independently. Now I don't think it's too bad at all, but I would like to squeeze a little bit more sparkle into the bird if possible, and I think that may take the difference between the background and the bird maybe a little bit too far. But of course we've got these smart objects here. I'm going to go back to my original background here. I can double click and open this back up into Camera Raw. I can go back to my Radial Filter, for example, liven that filter up. I'll hit the V key and I'm going to adjust it a little bit. I'm just going to back off a little bit. See the picture just brightening up a little bit, but still retaining that little bit of a vignette. Just going to stop at that point and OK that. As soon as that's opened up, and there you can see the difference, we've still got everything we need, but perhaps I did go a little too dark. But even if I change my mind now and think to myself, well, maybe I should have gone in between, I want it a bit darker but not as dark, doesn't matter. We can go back in as many times as we like, because we're always adjusting the raw data. We're not affecting the quality by making multiple changes. So let me look at my bird once again by selecting the layer, double clicking, opens up into Camera Raw where we left off. So I think what I was thinking of, just a little more contrast, maybe clarity, maybe blacks. Let's take a look. I'm going to push the clarity just a little bit. I've saved this just before I started this process. In case I'm trying something that doesn't come off, I can always go back to my previous layered saved version. I can maybe just push the blacks a little bit. Remember, we're only concerned with the bird here. Maybe even a tweak of the exposure down a little bit. But we don't want to lose too much under here. So even though I've got the blacks down, we can still push sometimes the shadows. And you can see how the shadows lifting just those feathers underneath the bird. But I think that's about as far as I want to go. The one area that keeps drawing my attention is just the cap of the head. I wonder if I zoom in and pick up my adjustment brush. Going to adjust the brush down. Looking over, I can see the exposure is down here. Let's drop the highlights and the exposure a little bit, and we'll just paint over that area just to take it down a little bit, just a little bit, just to keep that cap from drawing my eye right to the top of the head. I quite like that. I may even increase the saturation there as well, because it's going just a wee bit grey. I'm going to try this by clicking to open this up, and again I think we need to sit back in our chair, let go of the mouse or whatever it is we're using, and just study the image for a few minutes. Now, for all of those natural history enthusiasts who may be watching, you will notice that I haven't yet stepped outside of natural history rules, have I? All I've adjusted here is the contrast, colour, tone, everything to do with exposure, which my camera cannot do for me given the conditions we're shooting in. So it'd be quite okay for me to put this shot into a natural history competition, and it's broken no rules. But this is where I'm going to stray and start to break a few, because there's a couple of issues here which I want to deal with. I don't want to crop my image. Let's say I want to keep it the size it is. I've got a distraction here with a light leaf. I could burn that leaf in and stay within natural history rules, but of course if I touch it with the clone tool, suddenly the picture, as if by some miracle, then doesn't become a natural history picture. Perhaps someone can explain that logic to me. But that's what we're going to do. I've saved those two layers, so I'm quite happy now to say I'm going to live with this, although I'm still a bit unsure about that background. So even at this late stage, I'm going to double click, I'm going to go back, and I'm going to take that down just a little more. I'm going to pick up that circular or radial filter, hit the V key to hide it. I'm just going to take it down. I'm going to put my cursor in the exposure box here, and as you see I can use my down arrows to just move it a little bit. Sometimes when we try to dial these things in by moving the slider, it's difficult to get a very fine movement. I'm going to try that, click OK, and once it appears on screen, if I think I've got it right, I'm going to hit Control S to save again. You'll see it saving at the bottom left corner of the screen, because once I've got it saved, so I've got an escape route back just in case tomorrow I look at the picture and think, no, I need to go back and do something more. I've got the opportunity to do so. But right now, I'm going to choose to merge those two layers together, because I'm going to do a little bit of cloning now. But just to make sure it doesn't go wrong, I'm going to make a new blank layer over the top of the bird. I'm going to pick up my spot healing brush. I'm going to make sure I've got my sample all layers, because what will happen then is when I paint over the area that I think is obtrusive, it will fix it, but it will paint it on this layer. So I'll do this one as well, and I think I probably will do that one too. May need a few more touches around to really hide that. A little one down there, but the only other thing which is annoying me is this area here if I zoom in, because you can see remnants of bread that was put there to lure the birds within distance. In actual fact, it didn't lure the bird in question because it wasn't eating bread, but nevertheless I'd like to remove this. So I'm going to use my spot healing brush, and I'm just going to deal with these little bits and pieces just gently and remove them. We could make a bit of a task of this with copy and paste, but I don't think we need to do that. I think if we just take a bit of care, we can take all or most of this off, or certainly we can cover it up. If you have any difficulties at all, then you can always turn to the clone tool rather than the spot healing brush in certain circumstances. There's a little bit down there by the look. But if you just take your time, as I'm doing here, you can see that gradually we can remove certainly enough evidence that stops us from being drawn to that part of the twig. And I won't go, see, I'm getting a bit of repetition there, so maybe I'd either switch to the clone tool or the healing brush, and there's the only difference between the two is the healing brush, we take a clone source, so Alt click, get a source point, and then usually we can cover up any of those areas that give away that we've been working. But I don't think it would take us too long before we had that fully fixed. Certainly sufficiently that we wouldn't attract attention. What else would I do? Look at the difference it makes though. Just those little bits and pieces. It's great when you can do this because it demonstrates the worth of doing it. I'm sure when I do these sorts of things there's some people sitting there thinking, my God, he's a bit over the top with his manipulation, but they do make a difference, and even now I can see that one cropping up. I'm going to say I'm happy with this. In normal circumstances I would probably even save another version, but what I think I'll do here is say happy with that. I'm going to merge all of those together, just looking around the picture at just any other areas that I feel I want to deal with. Maybe I'm going to burn. I'm going to choose mid-tones, 8%, 10%, that should be okay. So if I wanted to just tone down some of these leaves, some of these areas, usually I make a fairly big brush, and you can see delicate stuff. I'm not doing it greatly, just a little bit. And when I think my bird is just nice there, I think I more or less have my finished image. And of course you would have seen this at the start because I've yet to record the view we're going to take of this with the original. Although I showed a before and after at the start of the video, I'd like to do that just to finish here. So there's the original image untouched through camera raw. Very weak because we exposed to the right to alleviate problems with noise. That in turn affects contrast, tonal range, the colour, and we've put all of that back and made the bird stand out from its background by giving that independent exposure to both the background and the bird, and touching any highlights and any areas that would be distracting to the picture.